Good morning. This Sunday, we're going to talk about Psalms of disorientation. Last week, we talked about how the Psalms allow us to hear two sides of a spiritual conversation. They allow us to hear the heart cry of the nation of Israel. We get to hear words of profound praise. We also get to hear words of anguish, words of doubt, words of frustration as they deal with the hardships of life. And we also get to hear words from God, words of hope, words of promise, words of correction as he speaks to and as he deals with the nation of Israel. And this sermon series is relying very heavily on the teaching of Walter Brueggemann as he talks about these Psalms in three different categories. Psalms of orientation, which we talked about last week, where they reflect seasons of people feeling satisfied that everything is going well with life, where we could simply say, "It is well with my soul. I'm at peace and I am experiencing fullness of life, and I am happy with the way that life is going. I am content." And today we're going to talk about these seasons of disorientation, or we could talk about them as seasons of disruption that come into our lives. And they talk about them as, or we could talk about them as seasons that have anguish, hurt, alienation, suffering. They bring about feelings inside of us of resentment, maybe even self-pity, maybe hatred. They just disruption, disorientation. All of a sudden, life was going along smoothly. We thought we had everything under control, and then something happens. And the disorientation may be something that is extremely personal and private that nobody else knows about, that we deal with in the depths of who we are as human beings. Or it could be something that is extremely massive and public that everybody is aware of. And so we have to deal with the public disruption or the public disorientation. Either way, whether it's public or whether it is private, we experience it as a personal end of the world. There is a disruption into our lives, and it generates an awful lot of emotion, and a lot of that emotion we see in the poetry, right, in the Psalms. Listen to Psalm 137 and listen to the emotion that is captured here. Hear the sense of disorientation, of disruption, of chaos in the psalmist's words as they are in captivity and as they cry out to God. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day that Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. They're not easy words to hear, are they? But there's been a disruption. There's been a disorientation in the life of the people of the nation of Israel, and they bring all of that to God. All of the emotion, all of the feeling, all of the anguish, all of the hurt, they bring it to God and they direct it to God. And one of the things that's interesting is that in our day and in our age, when people may experience life, they may experience the disorientation and the disruption of life, that the church largely continues to sing songs of orientation. And we are drawn to the Psalms of orientation instead of being drawn to the Psalms of disorientation. Like, take this past year, for example. The worldwide pandemic, civil unrest, racial tensions, political tensions, economic instability, all of that going on, all of that disorientation, and then largely we want to focus on Psalms of orientation. When what the Psalms teach us is that we're able to bring the fullness, the completeness, all of our experience of life, we're able to bring all of it to God, and that God meets us there, and that God helps us, and that God grows us, and that God ministers to us, even in the midst of seasons of just utter disorientation. As we focus on Psalms of orientation in a world that is increasingly aware that people are disorientated, we ought to ask the question, why? Why do we do that? And it could be that we share Psalms of orientation as a bold defiance to the world of chaos. As the world is in chaos, we're going to boldly declare Psalms of orientation, saying, that nothing is going to separate us from the love of God. We're going to plant our flag here, and we're going to boldly declare, nothing is going to separate us from the love of God. And so we are going to sing these songs, sing these Psalms of orientation. Or it could also be that we're moving through life focusing on the happy Psalms, not wanting to acknowledge, not wanting to be aware of the disorientation of life. It's a sort of, if I don't acknowledge it, it doesn't exist. Kind of like the ostrich with its head buried in the sand, not paying attention. Whatever the reasoning is, it's clear that singing these songs, the happy Psalms, the Psalms of orientation in the midst of disorientation is not, let me say that again, is not what we find in the scriptures. The psalmist shows us what it is like to bring all of our anxiety, to bring the fullness, to bring the completeness of who we are to God, and allow God to minister to us. And the reason that we can face these seasons of disorientation or darkness is that even in the darkness, that there is someone that we can address, someone who is going to bring about healing and wholeness. Listen to this from the Gospel of John, the first 5 verses of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Another way to say it is the light shines in the disruption, or in the disorientation, in the chaos, and the disorientation has not overcome it. We can bring the fullness of who we are before God, and God will overcome our disorientation, will overcome our sense of disruption, will overcome all the sense of anxiety and of stress that we may be feeling if we bring that faithfully to God. Listen to how Walter Brueggemann talks about these Psalms of disorientation. This is what he says. The use of these Psalms of darkness may be judged by the world to be acts of unfaith and of failure. But for the trusting community, their use is an act of bold faith, albeit a transformed faith. It is an act of bold faith on the one hand, because it insists that the world must be experienced as it really is and not in some pretend way. On the other hand, it is bold because it insists that all such experiences of disorder are a proper subject for discourse with God. Nothing is out of bounds, nothing precluded or inappropriate. Everything properly belongs in this conversation of the heart. To withhold parts of life from that conversation is, in fact, to withhold part of life from the sovereignty of God. Thus, these Psalms make the important connection. Everything must be brought to speech, and everything brought to speech must be addressed to God, who is the final reference for all of life. These Psalms of disorientation, they might make us feel uncomfortable. They lead us to acknowledge how life really is. They lead us to think thoughts and to utter words that we may seek to avoid, that we may seek to push down and to not speak and to not share. They cause us to let go of the dream that everything is managed and everything is under control. In the midst of a season of disorientation, we come to realize that this world can be a difficult place, that it can be a hard place. And part of the gospel transformation that takes place in these seasons of disorientation is that our eyes, that our ears, that our hearts, our minds are open to something new. We recognize that the way in which we see the world does not speak to the situation that we find ourselves in. And we need something more. And we're looking for something more. We look to hear the still small voice of God speak into our seasons of disorientation and of disruption and of chaos. And no matter what the source of our disorientation, whether it's ourselves, whether it's the actions of others, and whether it's the conflict of nations, whether it's illness, whether it's damaged relationships, there's only one place for us to direct our pleas for help, and it's God. It's the one who can intervene in a decisive way. Listen again to the words of Psalm 13 that Soren shared with us just a little bit earlier. And something happens. Something happens between verses 4 and 5. Listen and see if you can hear it, because there's a shift. There's a shift from words of disorientation to reorientation. There's a shift from chaos to hope. And that's what happens when we bring the fullness, the completeness of who we are to God and allow God to speak to us. Listen to the words of the psalmist. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer me, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing in the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. Did you capture it? Do you hear it? Bringing the fullness, the completeness, the anxiety, the stress, the heartache, bringing it before the one who can bring healing, sharing it openly and honestly with God. Something happens in the heart and the mind of the psalmist between verses 4 and 5. There's a kind of reorientation. And next week, we're going to talk about these Psalms of reorientation. They offer us a glimpse of how the Spirit of God works in our world. They express surprise when we are overwhelmed once again by the newness of God, by the gifts of God, by the fullness of God, by the completeness of God, to meet us in our times of need and to bring about healing and wholeness and completeness. I pray that wherever you find yourself, a season of orientation, a season of disorientation, a season of reorientation, that you will bring the fullness, the completeness of who you are before Abba Father. Amen.